5 years ago, my wife ran off with my brother the night before our wedding. At the reunion, she laughed and said, "Leaving you is the best thing I ever did." 5 minutes later, a pregnant woman entered holding a 3-year-old girl. My ex dropped her glass. My brother looked like he'd seen a ghost. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. It all started on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before the wedding. I was 45 years old and felt that life was finally giving me what I deserved. I wasn't a rich man, I never was. I was an industrial maintenance technician working in a processing plant on the outskirts of the city. I earned around $3,000 a month, and with that I maintained a simple but decent life. I had a small apartment on the 4th floor of a building with no elevator, a 10-year-old car that started almost every time, and a savings account with $12,000 that I'd gathered penny by penny for years to pay for the wedding I always dreamed of giving Celestina. Celestina. Where do I start talking about her? She was the kind of woman who walks into a room and reorganizes gravity, tall, dark shoulder-length hair, with a way of speaking that made anyone feel like they were the center of the universe when she paid attention to them. I met her at a co-worker's birthday party. She was there because she was a friend of the birthday boy's wife. We were introduced, we talked for 3 straight hours without realizing it, and when I said goodbye that night, I knew I was lost. We dated for 2 years. 2 years in which I believed with all the certainty a man in love can have that I'd found the right person. Celestina was affectionate, smart, fun. She talked about the future with a naturalness that calmed me. She wanted a house. She wanted stability. She said she didn't care about money, but about honesty. I believed her every word. Why wouldn't I believe her? What I didn't know, what took me too long to understand, is that Celestina had a very particular way of seeing the world. To her, people weren't entirely people. They were options, pieces on a board that moved according to what they could offer at any given moment. And I, at that time, was the best option she had. But my brother Valentin was waiting in the shadows. Valentin was 3 years younger than me. He was always my mother's favorite, although she never admitted it in those words. He was taller, more sociable. He had that ease to walk into any place and make everyone love him in 10 minutes. And unlike me, Valentin was about to inherit the biggest part of the family business, a construction materials distributor that my father had built with 30 years of work and which was worth back then something close to $400,000. I wasn't inheriting anything from that business, not because my father didn't love me, but because years before, when he offered me to come work with him, I chose my own path. I became a technician, I studied, I sought my independence. My father respected that, but the consequence was that the business was left for Valentin. Celestina knew it. She always knew it. What I didn't know until much later is that while I was saving those $12,000 for our wedding, while I was choosing the hall, while I was coordinating every detail with an excitement that now makes me ashamed to remember, Celestina and Valentin had been seeing each other secretly for months. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a cold, calculated decision made by 2 people who decided I was expendable. And the night before our wedding, while I slept at a friend's house, because tradition says the groom can't see the bride before the ceremony, Celestina packed her things from the apartment we already shared, left the ring on the kitchen table, and left with my brother without a call. Without a message, without a single word. I found out at 7 in the morning on my wedding day, when I went to the apartment to get my documents and found the ring alone on the table and her closet completely empty. That silence was the cruelest thing of all. No, not the abandonment, the silence. I still remember sitting on the kitchen floor with the ring in my hand, unable to cry, unable to think, understanding absolutely nothing. Outside, in some hall in the city, there were flowers, there were chairs arranged in perfect rows, there was an $800 cake, there were people putting on their best clothes to come see a wedding that was never going to happen. And I was there on the floor, alone, not yet knowing that the worst part wasn't that moment. The worst was yet to come. I had to be the one to call everyone. There was no way to avoid it. My phone was full of messages from relatives asking what time they should arrive, from friends confirming their attendance, from the hall coordinator asking if she could open the doors. And I was sitting on the floor of that kitchen with Celestina's ring in the palm of my hand, trying to find the words that don't exist to tell people there wouldn't be a wedding. The first call was to my mother. I dialed her number 3 times before the call went through. When she answered with that happy party morning voice, it took me almost 10 seconds to be able to speak. I told her Celestina had left, that the closet was empty, that she'd left the ring. There was a long silence on the other end. And then my mother said something that broke me in two in a way that even today, 5 years later, I haven't fully processed. She said, "Benjamin, Valentine didn't show up this morning either." I hung up. I don't remember hanging up, but I must have, because suddenly the phone was on the floor and I was still sitting motionless staring at the ring while something inside me reorganized all the information from the last 2 years in a brutal and silent way. Like when you finish a puzzle and suddenly see the full picture and can't believe you didn't see it before, that all the pieces were right in front of you the whole time. The times Valentine dropped by to visit me and Celestina took too long to greet him. The times she mentioned his name in conversations where it had no reason to come up. The night I got home early from work and found them sitting in the living room, too far apart, too formal, like two people who had just moved quickly upon hearing the key in the door. I saw it all, and I saw nothing, because you don't want to see what would destroy everything you love. The next 3 hours were the most humiliating of my life. I called every single person on the guest list, over 80 calls. I explained to uncles, to cousins, to coworkers, to neighbors, to the lady doing the flowers, to the photographer who was already setting up his equipment in the hall. I told each of them with the same worn-out and empty words that the wedding wasn't going to happen, that I was sorry, that I thanked them for their time. Some asked what had happened. I didn't know what to say, so I said we decided to separate by mutual agreement. It was a lie, but it was the only lie of dignity I had left at that moment. Others already knew the truth, because in small towns, and ours was one even if it had the name of a city, news travels faster than phone calls. By noon, half the city knew that Celestina had abandoned Benjamin the night before the wedding to run off with his own brother. By the afternoon, there were already embellished versions that I'd known beforehand, that I'd introduced them, that I deserved it for being naive, that it was always obvious Celestina was too much for me. That last part hurt me more than I expected. Not because it was cruel, but because a small part of me, in the worst moments of those weeks, wondered if it was true. The wedding money was almost entirely lost. The hall refunded half, because there was a clause in the contract. The photographer didn't refund anything. Neither did the bakery. Between lost deposits, services already paid for, and things there was simply no way to recover, a little over $7,000 was gone in one morning. $7,000 of the $12,000 I'd taken years to save vanished before noon on a Saturday, which should have been the best day of my life. I was left with $5,000, an apartment with her closet empty, and a silence I didn't know how to fill. The first few days were strange in a way that's hard to explain. I didn't cry immediately. I think the real pain took time to arrive, because the brain has a way of protecting you when something is too big to process all at once. I functioned, I got up, I went to work, I ate, I slept, but it was as if I did everything from inside a glass bell. Things happened around me, but they didn't fully reach me. Until they did. It was one night, almost 2 weeks later, when I was heating up something to eat, and I turned on the radio just to avoid the silence. And a song came on that Celestina always listened to while cooking. A silly, unimportant song. One of those you don't remember the name of, but you recognize the first 3 seconds. And something inside me simply broke. I sat on the kitchen floor for the second time in 2 weeks, and this time I did cry. I cried for a long time. I cried for Celestina, but I also cried for Valentine, who was my brother and who chose to do this to me. I cried for the 12 years we'd known each other, for the Christmases together, for the times he defended me when we were kids, for everything I thought we were to each other. I cried for the $7,000. I cried for the phone calls that morning. I cried for the shame of having had to explain to 80 people that my own fiancé had abandoned me for my brother. But most of all, I cried because I didn't know who I was without all that. I'd built my identity around that relationship, that wedding, that future I planned so carefully. And suddenly all of that had disappeared in one night, and I found myself at 45 alone, not really knowing where to look. With my family, things got complicated in a way I didn't anticipate. My mother never really knew how to handle the situation. Valentine was her son too, and although she never directly told me she was defending him, there was an awkwardness in her way of speaking, a willingness to not take sides that I felt as a silent abandonment. She called me off in those first few months, but the conversations were brief and careful, as if she were walking on broken glass. She never mentioned Valentine. She never mentioned Celestina. She talked about the weather, her garden, a neighbor who'd had a health problem. What else could I do? My father was different. My father called me 3 days after what happened, and without preambles, without beating around the bush, he told me that what Valentine had done was wrong, that he knew it, that I knew it, and that there was no way to dress it up any other way. He told me that if I needed anything, whatever it was, to call him. It was the shortest and most honest conversation I had in those months, and I still keep it carefully somewhere inside me. But not even my father could fix what was broken, because what was broken wasn't something external, it was something inside me. It was trust. The ability to believe that the people you choose to have close to you will act with the same loyalty with which you act towards them. That doesn't get fixed with a phone call. That takes years. And I still didn't know how long it was going to take me. I didn't know if I'd ever fully get it back. In those first months, honestly, I wasn't sure it was possible. The only thing I knew was that I had to keep getting up every morning. So that's what I did. I got up one day at a time, not yet knowing that those silent and gray days were the foundation of something I couldn't even imagine myself yet. The following months were the longest of my life, not because terrible things happened, but because almost nothing happened. And sometimes emptiness is worse than pain. Pain at least tells you that you're alive, that something matters, that there's a wound to heal. Emptiness just tells you that you're there taking up space, waiting for something to change without really knowing what or when. I went to work, came back, ate alone, slept badly, woke up at 3 in the morning with that kind of anguish that has no shape or name, the kind that simply makes you sit up in bed in the dark and won't let you close your eyes again. I would stare at the ceiling for hours, thinking about things that had no solution at 3 in the morning or at any other time. I thought about Celestina, not because I still loved her, or at least that's what I told myself, but because I couldn't stop wondering when she decided I wasn't enough. If there was an exact moment, a specific night, a conversation I don't remember in which she looked at Valentine and made the decision, or if she always knew and simply used me as a backup plan while she waited for the right moment. This question haunted me for months, and the worst part was that I was never going to have an answer. At work, things were complicated in a different way, not because my coworkers were cruel. Most were good people who simply didn't know what to say. So they chose to say nothing and treat everything with a forced normality that at times I appreciated and at other times I found unbearable. There was one, Horacio, who had worked with me for 8 years and who was one of the few people who treated me like a person during those months and not like an uncomfortable situation that had to be handled with care. Horacio was a direct man, of few words, with that kind of silent loyalty that doesn't make declarations, but shows up when it matters. One Friday afternoon, about 3 months after what had happened, he invited me for a beer after a shift. I was going to refuse, just as I'd refused every social invitation since the wedding that never was. But something that afternoon made me say yes. We sat in a simple bar near the plant, ordered 2 beers. Horacio didn't ask me how I was doing. He didn't tell me time heals everything. He didn't offer advice I hadn't asked for. He just ordered the beers. And when they arrived, he raised his and said, "To those who left, may they go very far away." I laughed. It was the first time I laughed in 3 months. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was barely one of those small smiles that come out without permission. But it was real. And at that moment, I understood I was still capable of laughing, that part of me hadn't completely died, that it was still there underneath, all the weight waiting for someone to give it space. That night, after the second beer, I told Horacio everything. Not the fine details, not the 3 in the morning or the ring on the table, but the summary, what had happened, how I'd found out about the $7,000, about the 80 phone calls. He listened without interrupting, With that way of listening, he has that makes you feel what you say carries weight. When I finished, he stayed silent for a moment and then said, "And what are you going to do now?" No, what are you going to do with them? Not how you're going to get revenge, not how you're going to make them pay, but what was I going to do with my life, with what was left? That question kept spinning in my head for weeks. What was I going to do? During the first few months after the wedding that never was, I'd been so focused on surviving the pain that I'd never really stopped to think about that question. I existed, I functioned, but I wasn't living. And there was a huge difference between the two things, a difference that Horacio, without knowing it, had forced me to see with that forward question. I started thinking about the money I had left. $5,000 wasn't much, but it was something. And I'd spent 20 years as an industrial maintenance technician. I knew the machines, I knew the processes, I knew exactly what failed and why in an industrial plant, and how much it cost to fix it if you call the right company. I'd spent years watching the plant where I worked pay fortunes to external providers for services I could do in half the time for half the price. The idea arrived on a Tuesday night with no drama, no cinematic revelation. I was just checking a fault on one of the production lines, a problem with a hydraulic transmission system that the external provider had quoted at $4,000 for repair, plus a 2-week wait. And while I checked it, I thought, I can do this. I've done it before, I can do it better, faster, and for less money. And then I thought, why don't I do it for others? The first steps were small and clumsy. I registered a company with the bare minimum. I printed business cards at a downtown stationery store that did 100 cards for $10. I started talking to acquaintances at other industrial plants in the area with maintenance supervisors who'd spent years dealing with the same old problems and paying too much for slow solutions. I got my first 3 clients through referrals from Horacio. The first contract was for $800. I worked an entire weekend, alone with my own tools, fixing a conveyor belt system in a food plant that had been having problems for weeks. When I finished, and the manager saw the belts running at normal speed, he looked at me like I'd done something miraculous. It wasn't a miracle, it was work, it was accumulated knowledge from 20 years of doing exactly this. But to him it was worth a miracle, and he gladly paid me for it that weekend. Driving back home with $800 in cash in my pocket, something shifted inside me. It wasn't euphoria. It wasn't the feeling of having beaten someone or proven anything. It was something simpler and deeper. It was the feeling that I was capable, that I had something real to offer, that the world hadn't ended in that kitchen with a ring on the table. I stayed at the plant for almost another year, working weekends and nights to build my client portfolio. I didn't sleep much. I didn't go out. I had no social life beyond occasional beers with Horacio, but I didn't care too much either. I had something to focus on, and that's what I needed at that moment in my life. What I didn't know was that while I was building in silence, on the other side the story was completely different. Valentine had taken control of the family business shortly after what happened. My father, who already had health problems for a while, had decided to retire earlier than planned and leave everything in my brother's hands. The materials distributor, which was worth $400,000, was now Valentine's responsibility. With Celestina by his side, the two were settled into a life they'd built on what they took from me. News reached me here and there. I didn't look for it, but in a small city things arrived anyway. That they'd moved to a bigger house, that Celestina had started hanging out in social circles she didn't have access to before, that Valentine had bought a new car, that they both appeared at events, in photos, projecting exactly the image she'd always wanted to project. I heard that news and didn't feel what I expected to feel. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel envy. I felt something closer to a cold, distant curiosity, like when you read about people you don't know in a story that isn't yours. Because by then, without having planned it, I'd started building something of my own. And what is your own always carries a different weight. What neither of them knew, what I myself didn't fully know yet, was that Valentine's business had cracks that couldn't be seen from the outside, that confidence isn't the same as competence, that inheriting something doesn't mean knowing how to manage it. And that Celestina, who had bet everything on that horse, was about to discover she'd made the most expensive mistake of her life, but that would still take time to be revealed. For now, from the outside, they were winning, and I kept building in silence. I quit the plan in March. It wasn't a dramatic decision. There was no moment of epiphany or a conversation that triggered it. It just arrived on a Monday morning when I sat across from my boss's desk. I handed in my resignation with a 30-day notice, as the contract stated. And when I walked out of that office, I felt something I didn't expect to feel. I felt fear. Not the paralyzing fear of those first months after the wedding that never was, but the clean and honest fear of someone who just let go of the only rope keeping him tied to solid ground. I was 46 years old, had an industrial maintenance company with 8 regular clients, an income that had reached almost $10,000 a month in the best months, and absolutely no safety net if things went wrong. It was the most vulnerable and the freest I'd felt in years. Horacio joined me for a final farewell beer that afternoon. We toasted without saying much. He patted my shoulder before we said goodbye and said it was about time. Nothing else. I didn't need anything else. The first 6 months working on my own were brutal in a way no one tells you when they romanticize the idea of having your own business. There were no real days off. There were no set hours. There were clients who called at 11 at night because a production line had failed and they needed a solution by 6 in the morning. There were good months and months where payments were delayed, and I checked my accounts with an anxiety that was hard to hide. There were weeks when I worked 60 hours and wondered if I hadn't made the biggest mistake of my life by giving up the stability of a fixed salary. But there was something else. There was also a feeling I hadn't had in a long time, the feeling that what I was building was mine, that every client who came in, every contract I signed, every problem I solved was the direct result of my work and nothing else. Not an inheritance, not a family connection, not being in the right place for the wrong reasons, mine. That word started meaning something different to me during that year. It was also during that period that I started to understand, little by little and without looking for it, what had really happened with Valentine and the family business. I didn't actively look for it. I had no interest in spying on his life or celebrating his problems. But we lived in the same city, and as I said before, in a small city things arrive. The first thing that arrived was a comment from a construction materials supplier I'd made contact with for matters of my own business. A man named Bernardo, serious, the kind who measures every word before letting it out. In a conversation about payments and deadlines, without me asking, he mentioned that my family's distributor had been delaying its accounts payable for months, that it wasn't a small amount, that some suppliers were already considering suspending credit. He said it without malice. It was just business information, nothing more. I nodded and changed the subject, but that night, alone in my apartment, I kept thinking about it. Not with satisfaction, not with relief, nor with that dark pleasure people sometimes feel when someone who hurt them starts to fall. What I felt was something more complicated, harder to name. It was a kind of cold sadness because my father had built that business with 30 years of hard work, because behind those numbers was the effort of a man who deserved for his legacy to last. And Valentine was destroying it, maybe not out of malice, but out of something sometimes worse than malice, out of incompetence disguised as confidence. Valentine had always had that quality of seeming sure of himself, even when he didn't know what he was doing. He was charismatic in that way that convinces people you're in control when in reality you're improvising. And in social life, it works very well. In business, eventually it hands you the bill. The second thing that arrived was more personal. My cousin Eulalia, who had always kept a cordial relationship with me despite the family fracture, called me one afternoon to tell me that my mother had been crying at a family gathering over the business problems, that Valentine had borrowed money from several relatives to cover operational debts, that my father, who was already retired and in fragile health, had found out about part of the situation and was devastated. Eulalia told me, with that tone of someone who doesn't know if they're doing right or wrong by giving that information, but who feels the other person has a right to know it. I listened to her until the end. I thanked her for calling me, and when I hung up, I stayed with the phone in my hand for a moment. I thought about calling my father. It took me 3 days to do it, but I called him. It was a difficult conversation. My father wasn't a man to show vulnerability, but that afternoon, I heard him tired in a way that went beyond the body. He talked to me about the business without going into fine details. He just told me things weren't going well and that he hoped they could be fixed. He didn't mention Valentine directly. He didn't ask me for anything. We just talked like two people who have always loved each other, but who haven't always known how to say it to each other. At the end of the call, he told me, "I'm glad you're doing well, Benjamin." And something in the way he said it, with that particular weight of words that mean more than they say, made me understand that he knew, that he'd always known more than he showed, and that in his own way, without declarations or speeches, he was telling me that I'd taken the right path. I hung up and had to go out for a walk for a while to calm something I felt in my chest and that I didn't really know how to classify. It was around that time that I met Louisa. It wasn't love at first sight. It wasn't a movie story. It was something much simpler and much more real than that. Louisa was an accountant. She worked independently with several small and medium clients in the city and came to me through a recommendation from one of my clients who told me I needed to organize my finances better if I wanted the business to truly grow. The first time we met was in a coffee shop. She arrived on time with a folder, a notebook, and a direct and unadorned way of speaking that I immediately found refreshing. There was no acting, there was no effort to impress. It was simply a person doing her job well and expecting me to do mine. We reviewed numbers for 2 hours. When we finished, while we waited for the check, there was a silence of the kind that sometimes happens naturally between two people who just work together and who still don't fully know each other. And in that silence, without really knowing why, I asked her if she wanted to grab another coffee. She considered the question for a moment, as if evaluating its real weight, and said yes. That second coffee lasted another hour and a half. We didn't talk about business. We talked about the city, about books neither of us had finished reading, about that weird feeling of reaching a certain age and realizing that some things you thought were permanent turn out to be temporary, and vice versa. I didn't tell her about Celestina that afternoon. It wasn't the right time, but there was something in that conversation that stuck with me in a way I didn't expect. I drove home thinking about her, not romantically yet, but with that quiet curiosity you feel when you meet someone who seems real in a way you don't always find, someone who isn't acting, who doesn't have a visible agenda, who simply is what she is. It took me a while to realize I hadn't found that in years. For the following weeks, we worked together regularly. She organized my finances with an efficiency that left me slightly ashamed of how I'd handled them up to that point. She explained things I should have known a long time ago, without making me feel bad for not knowing them. She asked me smart questions about the business that forced me to think about things I'd been avoiding. And between meeting and meeting, between number and number, without either of us planning it or declaring it, we started building something slowly, without rushing, the way things that matter should be built. What I still didn't know was that something we were building was going to be the most important part of everything that would come later. That Louisa wasn't just the person who came to sort out my finances. She was the person who, without either of us knowing it yet, was going to be standing in a hall full of people with our second child in her womb and holding her daughter's hand at the exact moment Celestina most needed to believe she'd won. But that was still far away. For now, we were two people drinking coffee and learning to trust. And that, after everything that had happened, was more than I'd dared to ask for. The business grew in a way that's still hard for me to believe when I think about it in perspective. Not all at once, not with a huge contract that changed everything overnight, but in that silent and cumulative way that things built well grow, brick upon brick, with no shortcuts and no cheating. A satisfied client would talk to another. A repair done, generated a call 3 months later for a preventive maintenance contract. A solution delivered on time and under the estimated budget built the kind of reputation no ad can buy. By the end of that second year, working alone, I had 17 regular clients and 2 employees. By the third, it was 23 clients and 5 people on the team. The income had gone from those first $800 of a weekend to numbers I never imagined when I was sitting on the floor of that kitchen with a ring in my hand. I didn't get rich overnight, but I became stable in a way money alone can't give. I became stable inside, and that was worth more. With Louisa, things progressed with that same calmness that characterized everything she did. There wasn't a formal conversation where we decided to be a couple. We simply at some point realized we already were, that we'd crossed that line without announcing it, because neither of us needed the announcement. I told her about Celestina one night, several months after meeting her while we were having dinner at my apartment. I told her everything without skipping anything, without embellishing anything. The ring on the table, the 80 calls, the $7,000, my brother. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say Celestina was a bad person or that Valentine was a traitor. She didn't build a comforting speech that was really just to make herself feel useful. She just looked at me for a moment and said, "And how are you now with all that?" Not how I was, how I am. Present, real, no drama. I kept thinking about that question longer than I expected, because the truth was I didn't fully know. There were days when I felt I'd processed it completely, that it was history, that it didn't carry more weight than I decided to give it. And there were other days less frequent, but still present, when something small and unimportant brought it back to me with an intensity that surprised me. I told her exactly that, without a filter, and she nodded as if it were the most normal answer in the world, as if she didn't expect me to be completely healed or completely broken, as if I could exist in that intermediate space without it being a problem. That's what finally convinced me, if I still needed to be convinced of anything. Our daughter Valentina was born 18 months after that dinner. We didn't name her that because of my brother. It was Louisa who picked the name before I told her about Valentine, and when she told me, I hesitated a second before answering. She noticed the hesitation and asked me what was wrong. I explained. There was a brief pause, and then she said, "I'm not going to let your brother's name take away the name I want for my daughter." She was right, and so she was named Valentina, with those dark eyes that from day one were exactly like mine, as if she wanted to make it clear from the beginning whose daughter she was. The first months of fatherhood were the most exhausting and the most complete of my life at the same time. I was 48 years old with a newborn, having never gone through that before, learning everything from scratch with that mix of terror and wonder I think all first-time parents feel, but which hit me with a particular force because it came after years of not being sure something like that was still possible for me. Louisa and I moved in together when Valentina was 3 months old. Not to my apartment on the 4th floor with no elevator. We bought a small house on the outskirts of the city with a garden just big enough and a kitchen with a window facing the garden, which Louisa demanded as a non-negotiable condition. We paid for it with what we both had saved, half and half, without either owing the other anything. That was also important to both of us. It was in that house one night, while Valentina slept and we drank coffee in the kitchen with the window facing the garden, that I received the call from Eulalia. Eulalia was my cousin, the same one who'd called me years before to tell me what was happening with the family business. She had that habit of calling when there was news she considered I needed to know, even if I hadn't asked for it. Most of the time, I didn't ask for it, because I learned that news from that side arrived on its own anyway. This time her voice had a different tone. She told me Valentine's business had collapsed. It wasn't a temporary crisis or a bump that could be fixed with a loan. It was a real collapse. Debts accumulated with suppliers for years, breached contracts, a line of credit with the bank that had been extended too much, and that finally the bank had decided not to renew. The distributor my father had built for 30 years, which was worth $400,000 when Valentine inherited it, was in the process of liquidation. Little was left, almost nothing. Eulalia told me, with that mix of genuine pity and involuntary morbid curiosity that people have for other people's bad news. She told me my mother was devastated, that my father, whose health had continued deteriorating, had found out the entire situation and that the doctor had said the stress wasn't doing him any good. I listened to everything without interrupting. When Eulalia finished, she asked me what I thought. I told her I was sorry for my parents, and it was true. For them, I truly was sorry with all sincerity, because they didn't deserve to carry the consequences of Valentine's decisions. For Valentine, I didn't feel what maybe Eulalia expected me to feel. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel relief or that instant justice you sometimes fantasize about when you think of the moment the person who hurt you finally faces consequences. What I felt was something closer to emptiness, a kind of conclusion without celebration, like closing a book you didn't like. Not with triumph, just with the quiet relief of finishing something. Louisa looked at me from the other side of the table. She hadn't heard the conversation, but she knew me well enough to know something had happened. I told her in a few words. She nodded slowly, held her coffee mug with both hands, and after a moment said, "How is your dad?" That's what mattered. I called my father the next day. It was a long conversation, the longest we'd had in years. He was tired, but lucid, with that clarity older people sometimes get when the body starts failing, but the mind sharpens. We didn't talk about the business in detail. We talked about Valentina. I sent him photos that afternoon, the first ones I'd sent him, and when he called me back an hour later to tell me the girl had my eyes, there was something in his voice I hadn't heard in a long time, something close to peace. What neither of us knew yet was that in a few weeks I'd receive an invitation I didn't expect, a family gathering, an event I'd tried to avoid for 5 years, but which this time, for reasons I still didn't fully understand, I felt I couldn't and didn't want to keep avoiding. A hall full of people who knew all of us and Celestina, who still didn't know what she was about to find. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a thick cream, colored paper envelope with handwritten letters. It wasn't the kind of envelope you open without preparing yourself a little. It was one of those that, even from the outside, tells you there's something inside that will require a decision. I left it on the kitchen table for almost an hour before opening it. Louisa saw it when she got home from work, looked at it, looked at me, and said nothing. That was one of the things I valued most about her. She knew when silence was more useful than words. It was an invitation to my Uncle Bernardo's 70th birthday. Hortensia was his wife, the woman who had organized every family gathering for the last 30 years with an efficiency that intimidated and a hospitality that disarmed. Bernardo's 70th was an event that, in our family, carried the weight of a historic date. He was my father's older brother, the visible patriarch, the man who presided over every family table with that quiet authority that doesn't need to raise its voice to be felt. Not attending wasn't really an option, and we all knew it. I hadn't seen most of my extended family since before the wedding. That never was. 5 years of carefully maintained distance, of polite but firm excuses, of "I can't this weekend" repeated as many times as necessary until the invitation started arriving less frequently. It wasn't resentment, it was survival. I needed that time and that distance to build what I built without the constant weight of the looks and the comments and the inevitable comparisons. But 5 years is a long time. And Bernardo's 70th was exactly the type of event that gathered everyone, absolutely everyone, which meant Valentine would be there and Celestina too. I stared at the invitation for a good while. Louisa sat across from me with 2 cups of tea, placed one in front of me without asking if I wanted it, and waited. I showed her the invitation. She read it slowly, left it on the table, and looked up. "Do you want to go?" she asked me. Not "should you go?" Not "what are you going to do?" Yes, if I wanted to, as if my desire were the center of the decision and not the family obligation, nor what people would say, nor the strategic calculation of what message attending or not attending sent. I thought about my Uncle Bernardo, about my father, whose health had continued to be fragile and who would be there that night, about the 5 years I'd spent building a life that had nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of. Valentina, who was 3 years old and who still didn't know almost anyone from my family. About the baby Louisa had been carrying in her womb for 4 months, and that it would be the first time part of my family found out about its existence. "Yes," I said, "I want to go." Louisa nodded, as if that had been the only possible answer. The following days, I had a calmness I didn't expect. There were no sleepless nights reviewing possible scenarios. There was no anticipated anxiety or mental rehearsals of conversations that maybe would never happen. It was as if something inside me had reached a place from where I could see that reunion without fear. Not because I didn't care, but because what I'd built in 5 years was solid in a way no comment in a hall could tear down. The afternoon of the event, while I was getting ready, Louisa walked into the room holding Valentina's hand. The girl was wearing a navy blue dress Louisa had chosen with that attention to detail she put into everything. She looked at me with those dark eyes that are still mine every time I see them and told me with the solemnity of a 3-year-old, "Daddy, are we going to the party?" "Yes, my love," I told her. "We are going to the party." Louisa looked at me over the girl's head with that half smile of hers that needs no explanation. We arrived at the hall when there were already quite a few people. It was an elegant place, but not pretentious. The type of space Hortensia always chose with that instinct of hers for environments that feel right without effort. There were white flowers, soft music, round tables with linen tablecloths, the kind of gathering that in my family marked important moments. The first thing I did was look for my father. I found him sitting near the window with my mother by his side. When he saw me approaching, he stood up with that new slowness his movements had, but with a firmness in his eyes that hadn't changed. We hugged. It wasn't a long or dramatic hug. It was the kind of hug that contains more than it shows, that says things we haven't learned to say with words. Then he saw Valentina. He crouched down slowly in front of her at her level and looked at her as if he were seeing something he'd been waiting a long time to see. The girl studied him for a moment with that evaluating seriousness little kids have, and then, without warning, she hugged him. My father closed his eyes for a second. My mother took my hand and squeezed it without saying anything. It was Eulalia who a little later came over to say hi with that usual energy of hers and told me in my ear, almost in passing, that Valentine and Celestina were already there, that they'd arrived early, that Celestina was very dressed up, that Valentine looked tense. She said it with that neutral tone we use when we want to give information without assuming responsibility for how the other person receives it. I nodded and thanked her. I kept greeting people. I kept introducing Louisa, who navigated the hall with that ease she had for being comfortable in any environment. I kept carrying Valentina when she got tired of walking. I saw them about 40 minutes after arriving. They were on the opposite side of the hall. Valentine with that blue suit that fit a bit too big on his shoulders. Celestina with a red dress that cost more than I made in a month when I was 25. From a distance, they looked exactly like what they'd always wanted to look like. The successful couple, the ones who had one. Celestina saw me before I could pretend I hadn't seen her. She looked right at me with that calculated calmness that was always her best act and sketched something that wasn't quite a smile, but was designed to look like superiority. Valentine saw me a second later. He couldn't hide it as well. For a moment, just a moment, I saw something on his face that looked almost like relief, as if carrying what he'd done for 5 years weighed more than he wanted to admit. But that moment passed quickly because Celestina took her glass, crossed the hall with that way she had of moving that always seemed designed to be watched, and stopped in front of me. She looked me up and down once slowly. And then, with that soft and perfectly modulated voice she'd learned to use as a weapon, she said, "Benjamin, it's been a long time. You look the same." It wasn't a compliment. We both knew it. I replied with a brief greeting. She looked towards where Louisa was, who at that moment was talking to Eulalia on the other side of the hall, holding Valentina's hand and her belly visible under the blue dress. She looked at her for a second and then turned her eyes back to me with something that wanted to look like pity, but was actually something else. It was a person's attempt to establish a hierarchy before the conversation even started. "Is it your partner?" she asked with that small and deliberate pause where the name should have gone. "My family," I said. She smiled. The wrong smile. And that was when she raised her glass to me and said the words she'd wish 5 minutes later she'd never said. "Leaving you is the best thing I ever did in my life, Benjamin." She said it slowly, with that deliberate clarity of someone who has rehearsed a line and waits for the exact moment to drop it. Not in a low voice, not like something intimate between two people who have history. She said it with a calculated volume, so the people nearby would hear it, so there would be witnesses, so it would be clear who was in control of that reunion. Around me, 2 or 3 conversations died down. I felt the stares before I saw them. That particular silence that happens when people sense something is going on and collectively decide not to intervene, but not to leave either. Celestina held my gaze with that usual confidence of hers. The glass in her hand, the red dress, the posture of someone who is exactly where they want to be. Valentine was 3 meters away with a glass he hadn't touched in several minutes, looking away with that visible discomfort of someone who knows what's happening isn't going to end well, but doesn't know how to stop it. I didn't reply immediately, not because I didn't know what to say, but because at that moment, while looking at her, I felt something completely unexpected. Not rage, not humiliation, not that burning in the chest I'd felt so many times in the first months after the wedding that never was. I felt a calm so deep and so complete that for a second it surprised even me. It was the calm of someone who knows exactly what they have. The calm of someone who doesn't need to win this conversation because they already won something much more important a long time ago. I took a small sip from my glass of water. I let her speak a moment longer in that silence she interpreted as my discomfort, and which was actually something else entirely. And then, with a quiet voice that had no visible edge, but cut anyway, I said, "I'm glad you found peace with that decision, Celestina." Nothing more. She blinked once. She didn't expect that. She expected defensiveness or awkward silence, or some version of the Benjamin from 5 years ago who still carried the weight of what she'd done to him. She didn't expect serenity. Serenity didn't give her material to work with. She tried to recover her ground. "Look, no hard feelings," she said, as if the hard feelings were something I had, and she was being generous by forgiving me. "Things happen for a reason. You and I were never what I needed. Sometimes you have to be honest with yourself, even if it hurts." There was a murmur nearby. Someone we both knew had just heard that and couldn't completely hide their reaction. I looked at her for a moment, and instead of answering, I looked at the clock on the wall of the hall. Not because I cared about the time, but because I knew, with a certainty I couldn't explain to anyone at that moment, that the time left was counted in minutes, and I wanted to see it. I wanted to be completely present for what was about to happen. It was exactly 4 minutes and something. First, I heard Valentina's voice. That particular voice of 3-year-olds when they see someone they recognize and get excited with no filter or calculation. A sharp and happy daddy that crossed the hall with that clarity only sounds coming from something completely real have. And then I saw her come in. Louisa crossed the hall doors holding Valentina's hand, and her 7-month belly forward with that navy blue dress she'd chosen that morning with the same naturalness with which she chose everything. She didn't walk in looking to be seen. She didn't walk in with calculated steps or a constructed pose. She walked in simply because she was arriving at the place where we were, because Valentina had pulled her toward the door as soon as she saw I was near. But the hall saw her. Everyone saw her, not because she tried to get attention, but because there was something in that image. That pregnant woman with a 3-year-old girl running toward me, which had a narrative weight that needed no explanation. The people who knew all of us understood in seconds what they were seeing. The people who didn't know us felt anyway that something important had just walked into the room. Valentina reached me, and I picked her up. She hugged my neck with that disproportionate strength little kids have when they hug without reservations, without holding back, with everything. Louisa arrived a second later, stood by my side with that calmness of hers, gave me a brief kiss on the cheek, and greeted the people nearby with a genuine smile, as if it were the most normal thing in the world, because to her it was, because she didn't exactly know what she just interrupted. Or maybe she sensed it, but she cared less about that than she cared about being where she was supposed to be. That was when I looked at Celestina. The glass had fallen. She didn't let go of it slowly. She didn't let it go with control. It slipped from her hand in that way things fall when the body reacts before the mind can intervene. The crystal exploded against the marble with a sound that cut what was left of the conversation in the hall, and the champagne splashed the hem of that red dress that cost more than I made when I was 25. Nobody looked at the pieces on the floor. Everyone was looking at Celestina. Her face was a document. She went through 3 or 4 states in less than 2 seconds, all visible, none controlled. First surprise, then something that wanted to be indifference but came out as shock. Then an attempt to compose herself that arrived too late, because too many people had already seen the first 2. She looked at Louisa, looked at the belly, looked at Valentina in my arms with those dark eyes that are mine looking back at her without understanding why all the adults in the room had suddenly gotten weird, and then she looked at Valentine. Valentine was white, not pale white, the kind of white a face turns when the blood rushes inward because the body is processing something too big to handle normally. He looked at me, looked at Louisa, looked at Valentina, and on his face I saw something I hadn't seen or expected to see in 5 years. I saw real shame, not the social discomfort of someone in an embarrassing situation, but that deeper and more silent shame of someone who realizes in a moment they didn't choose what they really did, what they really lost. The distance between the story they'd told themselves for 5 years and the reality standing in front of them at that moment. A built life, a real family, a man who moved on without resentment and without needing anyone to see him do it. All of that in one image. In seconds, Hortensia, who was the only person in that hall with the reflexes and the authority to handle the moment, appeared with a napkin and crouched down toward the pieces of glass, saying something about how it was nothing, that these things happen, bringing air back into the room with that hosting competence of hers built over decades. People started moving again. Conversations resumed, quieter, more loaded. Eulalia was nearby and looked at me with an expression that needed no words. I settled Valentina on my arm, put my free hand on Luisa's back, and moved toward the table where my parents were. My father saw us approaching and stood up slowly. I offered my hand to Luisa so she wouldn't trip over the chair, and she took it with that naturalness of two people who have spent years moving through the world together. Behind me, I heard Celestina's voice, low and tense, saying something to Valentine. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to turn around. My father took Valentina in his arms with that new care his movements had, and the girl accepted it with the same unfiltered generosity as always. Luisa greeted my parents with that genuine warmth that can't be faked. My mother hugged her with an emotion she'd kept hidden for a long time, and that found in that moment the right place to come out. And I stood there in the middle of all that, in that hall that smelled of white flowers and family history, with everything I'd built gathered in a 2-meter radius. I thought about the ring on the kitchen table. I thought about the 80 calls. I thought about the $7,000. I thought about the floor of that kitchen where I sat twice in 2 weeks, and I thought that if I had to choose again, I'd choose exactly the same path. Not the pain, not the betrayal, but what I did with it, because what I did with it brought me here, and here was exactly where I wanted to be. The night continued with that particular tension family events have when something important just happened, but nobody names it directly. It was as if the hall had absorbed what happened and was digesting it in silence, in the glances exchanged over glasses, in the conversations that lowered their volume when someone walked by, in that quiet electricity that floats in the air when people know they're witnessing something they'll remember. I sat with my parents and with Luisa at a table near the window. Valentina settled on my father's lap with that absolute ownership little kids have when they decide someone belongs to them. And my father led her with an expression I hadn't seen on him in years, a light expression, as if something he'd carried for a long time had settled into a more tolerable place. My mother talked to Luisa with that concentrated intensity of someone making up for lost time. She asked her things, listened to the answers with real attention, laughed at the right moments. Luisa answered with that unadorned honesty of hers that made conversations with her always feel like solid ground. I watched them all and felt something hard to name. It wasn't euphoria, it wasn't triumph. It was something closer to the quiet satisfaction of seeing that the pieces one placed one by one over years ended up forming exactly the picture one expected, or something better than the picture one expected. It was Bernardo who approached our table about an hour after the dinner started. My uncle Bernardo turned 70 that night, but he carried it with that particular solidity of men who have worked their whole lives with their hands and their heads at the same time. He was the kind of man who doesn't make unnecessary statements, but when he speaks, people listen. He stopped in front of me, looked at me for a moment with those eyes of his that always seemed to see more than they showed, and offered me his hand. I shook it. "I'm glad you came, Benjamin," he said. Nothing more. But in the way he said it, there was a weight we both understood. It wasn't just the birthday boy's greeting to the guest. It was an older man's recognition of a younger one who had made difficult choices and stood by them with dignity. It was the way men of a certain generation have of saying important things without saying them directly. I thanked him for the invitation. He asked about the business. I told him briefly, without exaggerating or minimizing. He nodded with that silent approval that's worth more than any elaborate praise. Then he looked at Luisa, wished her the best with the baby, and walked away to another table with that economy of movement of someone who knows exactly how much time and energy they have and doesn't plan to waste any. It was around that time I noticed Valentine had moved to the edge of our area. Not to our table, not directly. He was standing about 6 or 7 meters away near the bar with a glass he still wasn't drinking from, looking toward us with that expression I'd seen earlier in the hall and that hadn't completely disappeared. The shame was still there, more settled now, less sharp, but deeper, like something that had found its permanent place on his face that night. Celestina wasn't by his side. I looked around and found her at a table on the other end of the hall, talking to a woman I didn't recognize, with that posture too straight and too controlled of someone making an active effort to look like everything is fine. The glass that had fallen had been replaced by another one she also didn't seem to have touched much. Valentine looked at me. I looked at him. There was no hostility in that exchange, nor warmth either. It was simply two people recognizing each other across 5 years of distance and everything that distance contained. I saw on his face that he wanted to say something, that there was something he'd been carrying for a long time, and that tonight in that hall had found a weight he couldn't keep ignoring. I got up from the table, not because I decided to have that conversation, but because I felt that if it was going to happen, I preferred it to happen standing up and in a space I chose. I walked over to the bar, ordered another glass of water, and waited. Valentine took less than 2 minutes to approach, stood next to me, ordered something without looking at the bartender, then stayed silent for a moment looking at his glass, and when he finally spoke, he did it with a low voice that was completely different from any version of his voice I remembered. "I know there isn't anything I can say to change what happened," he said. I didn't look at him right away. I kept looking out at the hall. I didn't reply. "There isn't anything." Another silence. "She told me that you and her were already doing badly. She said it was a matter of time, that if it wasn't me, it was going to be someone else." I said it slowly, without emotion. "And you believed her, because you wanted to believe her." It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation. And, by the way his face responded, I knew it was the first time someone had said it to him in those words, and that some part of him had already known it for a long time. "Yes," he said, barely audible. I took a sip of water. "The business," I said after a moment, not as a question, as opening a topic. He exhaled a tired sound of someone who has been carrying something for a long time that's too heavy for the distance traveled. "It's over," he said. "Very little is left. Some debt still. I'm trying to resolve what I can, but there are things that no longer have a solution. Dad knows everything. He knows enough." A pause. "That's what weighs on me the most, not the money that he knows." I looked at him, then, for the first time in that conversation, I looked at him straight on. Valentine had aged in that particular way people age when they've carried guilt for a long time. Not just physically. There was something in his eyes that wasn't there 5 years ago, something worn out like a fabric that has been stretched too much and doesn't quite recover its original shape anymore. I didn't feel satisfaction seeing him like this. What I felt was something more unexpected. I felt pity, not the condescending pity of the one who won looking at the one who lost, but something more human and more complicated than that. The pity of someone who understands that people sometimes make terrible decisions, not because they're completely bad, but because at a given moment they chose what they wanted to see instead of what was real, and then they have to live with that. I'd had 5 years to process my part of that story. Valentine would have the rest of his life to process his. "How is she?" I asked without naming her. We both knew who I was talking about. Valentine took a moment to answer. "She's leaving," he said finally. "She hasn't said it yet in those words, but I know. When the business started failing, she changed. It was gradual at first, and then all at once. Now we're two people living in the same house, waiting for one of us to say what we both already know." I listened to him without interrupting. "She bet on the wrong horse," I said, without cruelty, like someone who simply names what is. Valentine let out something that wanted to be a laugh, but came out as a tired and humorless sound. "Yes, I guess she did." There was a long silence between us, and then Valentine said something I didn't expect. "Your daughter has your eyes." He said it with a different voice, softer, without the weight of everything before, as if in that small and concrete detail he'd found the only honest way to tell me something bigger he didn't know how to say. I looked at him for a moment. "I know," I said. I walked away from the bar with my glass of water and went back to the table where Luisa and my parents were, and Valentina, who by that time had fallen asleep in my father's arms with that absolute trust little kids have who know without needing an explanation that they're in a safe place. I sat down. Luisa looked at me with that silent question that needs no words. I touched her hand on the table. She understood. From the other side of the hall, Celestina was watching us. Not with superiority anymore. Not with that calculated calmness from the beginning of the night anymore. She watched us with something that was much harder to sustain than arrogance. She watched us with the face of someone who just understood completely and without the possibility of denying it, that the story she'd told herself for 5 years wasn't the real story. The real story was at that table, and my father holding a sleeping girl in his arms, and my mother talking to Luisa as if she'd known her all her life, and that baby arriving in 2 months who still doesn't have a name, but already has a family waiting for him, and in me who took my glass of water and didn't need to say absolutely anything. The event ended past midnight. My Uncle Bernardo was the last to say goodbye to every guest, as he had done at every family gathering for the last 30 years, with that hosting protocol of his that delegates the closing to no one. When it was our turn, he took Luisa's and my hand at the same time, looked at both of us, and simply said, "Take good care of yourselves." Hortensia hugged Luisa with that warmth of hers, as a woman who has seen many stories and knows how to recognize the ones that end well. Valentina was still asleep. I carried her to the car with that exaggerated care you learn when you have a child, and that never completely goes away. I settled her head against my shoulder and placed her in her seat with a gentleness Luisa always says is my best version. I drove home in silence. Luisa rode in the passenger seat with her hand resting on her belly, looking out the window at the trees passing under the streetlights. We didn't need to talk. We'd learned to read each other's silence in that way only people who truly know each other learn, who have spent real time together without acting, who have seen the hard parts and chose to stay anyway. When we got home and put Valentina in her bed, I stood in the doorway of her room for a moment watching her sleep. It's something I do more often than I'd admit out loud. I stand there in the dark of the hallway, watching that quiet breathing and that way she has of sleeping with her arms open as if the world were completely safe. And I feel something that doesn't have an exact name, but that I recognize every time. It's gratitude partly, but it's also something more specific. It's the awareness that exactly this, wouldn't have existed if things hadn't gone so wrong in the way they went. If Celestina hadn't left that ring on the table, if Valentine hadn't made the decision he made, if I hadn't sat on that kitchen floor twice in 2 weeks feeling like the loneliest man in the world, all that pain was the price of admission to this life. This life was worth every penny of that price. Luisa found me in the hallway, stood next to me, looked at Valentina for a moment, and then rested her head on my shoulder with that usual naturalness. I put my arm around her. We stayed like that for a while in silence, in the quiet darkness of our house with a window facing the garden. "How are you?" she asked me. The same question as always. Present. Real. "Good," I said. And it was true in a way that hadn't always been easy to say. "You talked to him?" "Yes." And I thought of Valentine at the bar with his untouched glass and his worn-out eyes. I thought of that low voice I didn't recognize at first, because I'd never heard my brother talk like that. Without the armor of charisma, without the manufactured confidence. Simply as a man carrying too much and who for a moment chose not to pretend he wasn't paying what he had to pay. "He is paying," I said. "Not with money, with something else." Luisa nodded slowly. She didn't ask for more details. She understood there are things that don't summarize well in words, and that trying to do so strips them of something essential. We went to sleep, and I slept in a way I hadn't slept in years, without the 3 in the morning, without the ceiling, without that weight of questions that have no answer at any hour. I slept like someone who has arrived somewhere and knows it. The following weeks brought that kind of quietness you learn to value when you've spent enough time without it. The business kept growing. We closed a new contract with a manufacturing plant in the region that tripled the workload from the previous quarter. I hired 2 more people. Horacio, who had quit the original plant 6 months earlier, had joined the team as operations supervisor with a salary that gave him real stability for the first time in years. There was something in that gave me a particular satisfaction, not just the business growth, but that growth gave concrete things to concrete people who deserve them. My father came to visit us 3 weeks after Bernardo's event. It was the first time he was at our house. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon with my mother, who brought 2 containers of food nobody asked her for, and which she placed in the kitchen with the quiet authority of someone who knows she's doing the right thing. My father walked through the house slowly, looking at every room with that particular attention of his. He stopped in the garden. He looked at it for a moment in silence. Then he looked at me. "It's nice, Benjamin," he said. 2 words with that weight words have when they come from the right place. We didn't talk about Valentine that afternoon, not because it was a forbidden subject, but because it wasn't necessary. There were other more important things to invest those hours in. My mother played with Valentina for almost 2 hours with an energy I hadn't seen in her in a long time. My father and I drank coffee in the garden and talked about simple things, about work, about the neighborhood, about a plant Louisa had planted near the fence that had grown faster than expected. It was an afternoon without drama and without statements. It was perfect because of that. Our son was born 7 weeks after that visit. We named him Horacio. Yes, after him. After the man who one afternoon invited me for a beer when I'd gone 3 months without laughing and who asked me the simplest and most important question nobody had asked me in those months. When I told him the name we'd chosen, Horacio looked at me with that face of a man who doesn't quite know how to handle emotion and simply nodded several times in a row without saying anything. That was also perfect. I found out about Celestina and Valentine through Eulalia, as almost always. They separated 2 months after Bernardo's event, without a public scandal, without statements, with that discretion endings sometimes have when they've been inevitable for a long time. Celestina left the city. I didn't find out where, and I didn't ask. Valentine stayed, trying to resolve what was left of the business with a delayed responsibility that, according to my mother, had arrived too late to save the material things, but that maybe still served to save something more internal. My mother told me Valentine had gone to see my father, that they'd talked for a long time, that my father had listened to him until the end without interrupting, that when he finished he hadn't told him everything was fine or that he forgave him with easy words that would cost nothing. He'd told him he loved him and that loving someone doesn't mean approving of what they do, that they could be both things at the same time. My father always knew how to say the important things. I didn't know if Valentine and I would someday come to have something resembling what we were before. I made no promises in any direction. Those things aren't decided. They are built or not built, slowly, with time, and with the willingness of both. And none of those things can be forced without it being noticed. What I did know was that I carried no resentment, not because I was an extraordinarily good man, nor because I'd reached some enlightenment that put me above human things, but because resentment is heavy. And I learned in the hardest way possible that you can't build anything solid while carrying unnecessary weight, that you have to let go to be able to lift, that real freedom isn't the absence of pain, but the decision not to let that pain define everything that comes after. Celestina had taught me that without meaning to, I was in her twisted and involuntary way thankful for that. One night, when Horacio was 6 weeks old and Valentina was sleeping in her room with her arms wide open as always, I sat in the kitchen with the window facing the garden with a cup of coffee that was getting cold while I looked outside. I thought about the ring on the table. I thought about it without the weight it had for so long. The way you think about something that happened and that no longer has the power to hurt you, that is simply part of the story that brought you to where you are. Louisa walked into the kitchen, saw the cold coffee, looked at me with that expression of feigned disapproval of hers that always makes me want to laugh, and put the coffee in the microwave without saying anything. She brought it back to me hot, sat across from me, and we stayed there in the good silence of our kitchen with the window facing the garden. With 2 kids asleep in their rooms, and a business that kept growing, and a life that owed nothing to anyone except the work and the decisions we'd made together. Outside, the garden was dark and quiet. The plant near the fence had continued to grow, And I, for the first time in a long time, didn't have any unanswered questions waiting for me at 3 in the morning. I just had this, and this was enough. It was more than enough.